at least one regional director who had direct and strong connections with Mr. Estrada was defiant. When I confronted him, he said, "Napagalitan ako ni Presidente nang simulan ko ang kampanya laban sa weteng dito. Sino ba ang susundin ko? Chief PNP o Commander-in-Chief?" I was successful in instituting reforms in the PNP because Mr. Estrada gave me full authority which I asked in the first place when I got appointed to the post. But because of weteng, Mr. Estrada issued a written memorandum to then Secretary of Interior and Local Government Alfredo Lim, effectively taking away from me the authority to appoint and remove police officials down to provincial director level. Hindi nga talaga mahina ang ulo ng presidenteng ito, I told myself. By removing that authority, I could no longer discipline my officers. I would fail in my anti-gambling operations, and worse, I would definitely fail in my mission. Resigning my position crossed my mind then, Mr. President. I spent many sleepless nights agonizing over my situation. In one of our Cluster E cabinet meetings held in the office of the Department of Foreign Affairs, then AFP Chief of Staff General Angelo Reyes took pity on me and gave his advice. He said, "Pare, Commander-in-Chief natin yan. Pagbigyan mo na muna ngayon at saka nyo na lang pag-usapan ang problema ninyo ni Presidente." I answered him, Mr. President, "Sir, question de prinsipyo ito. Ako ang nasa tama sa labang ito, tanggalin na lang niya ako, pero hindi ako bibigay dito." I found out later, Mr. President, that indeed, Mr. Estrada had started gathering legal basis to justify my relief. On hindsight, people close to Mr. Estrada and this representation would say, as an afterthought, EDSA dos could not have happened had Mr. Estrada listened to General Lacson's consistent advice on weteng. Simple. But on the other hand, EDSA dos would not have happened if I went along with Mr. Estrada and Chavit Singson and all together enjoyed tolerating weteng operations. Why? Bingo 2 ball would not have been conceived to legalize weteng. We all know that it was during its implementation that there was a misunderstanding and falling out between Mr. Estrada and Chavit Singson. Mr. Estrada realized that I would not waver on my stand against weteng and thought that by legalizing it, I would not have any more reason to conduct raids and operations. Mr. President, weteng is just one illustrative insight into the character of Mr. Estrada as a government official and as president of this country. There were other sinister behavioral patterns that must be told to the Filipino people. Sa likod ng isang makamahirap na Joseph Estrada na mahal ng masa ay maraming transaksyon na may kasamang pang-aabuso gamit ang kapangyarihang kaagapay ng pagiging Pangulo ng Bansa upang magkamal ng maraming salapi para sa sariling kapakanan. In August of 1998, in the early part of Mr. Estrada's abbreviated presidency, Mr. Alfonso Yuchenko was pressured to sign conveyance of a 7.75% PTIC, or the Philippine Communications Investment Corporation holdings, equivalent to 18,720 shares to Metro Pacific, represented by Manuel V. Pangilinan. These PTIC holdings correspond to 2,017,650 PLDT common shares, Mr. President. Mr. Yuchengco, I also learned later, was pressed to sign a waiver of his right of first refusal over the PTIC shares of the Cojuangco Meer Group. It was only after the passage of many years that I was to learn that Mr. Estrada, barely 2 months in office then, used the PNP to harass Mr. Yuchengco's son, Tito, with threat of arrest on some trumped-up drug charges to force his father, Mr. Yuchengco, to sell. This harassment of the young man was accomplished through deliberate and obvious physical surveillance. Napag-alaman ko, Ginoong Tagapangulo, na matagal-tagal din palang may kimkim na galit daw sa akin ang pamilya Yuchengco sa dahilang ang pagkakaalam nila ay sa akin iniutos ni Mr. Estrada ang panggigipit sa kanila upang mapuwersang magbenta ng kanilang pag-aaring shares of stocks ng PLDT. Sa inyo, Ginoong Pangulo ng Senado, mga pinagpipitaganang kong kasamahan at 10 ng pamilya Yuchengco, wala po akong kamalay-malay sa pangyayaring yan. At kung halimbawa mang sa akin iniutos ni Mr. Estrada ang gawaing iyon, ay siguradong hindi ko po susundin. The bigger and more important question remains, what was the deal in pesos and centavos between Mr. Estrada and Mr. Pangilinan, if any? Or should we rather ask how much was involved? Sa larangan naman ng smuggling sa customs at sa iba pang lugar, ay hindi rin masusukat ang kakayahan ni Mr. Estrada, Mr. President. When Mr. Estrada transferred the mission of going after smugglers from the late Lieutenant General Jose Calimlim's unit in PSG and ISAF to the PAOK-TF, he gave me the mandate to go hammer and tongs against smugglers. Yet, one morning, I received a call from Mr. Estrada. May mga tao ka raw na naghaharas sa customs, he said with a low tone. After checking with my officers, I replied, wala sila sir sa loob ng customs zone, kaya imposibleng makapangharas sila doon. Nandun sila sa labas, malapit sa Manila Hotel, at may inaabangan na ilulusot na shipments ng dressed chicken parts from China and the United States. He bellowed, basta, i-pull out mo. A few days later, in a light conversation on the topic of smuggling inside his office in Malacanang, I told Mr. Estrada, alam mo sir, 20 40-foot containers sana ng dressed chickens ang nahuli natin kung hindi mo iniutos i-pull out ang mga tao natin. With a mocking voice, he said, sana hindi kayo nag-pull out. Akala ko, Mr. President, nang bigyan ako ng kautusan, lipulin ang mga smugglers sa pier, totoong-totoo at seryoso. Ako namang si Gago, trabaho lang ng trabaho, yun pala moro-moro.